When Henry leaned in to hug his granddaughter, her innocent words cut deeper than she could ever know. "Don't hug me. You smell like old people." What she didn't realize was that one sentence would shatter him and set him on a journey he never expected. A journey of silence, of memories, of strangers who became family. And in the most unlikely place. Henry discovered something powerful. Sometimes the hug you give away is the one that finds its way back. Sunday mornings had their own rhythm in the Benson house. The curtains breathed gently with the early breeze, carrying the scent of dew and freshly cut grass through the open window. The clock on the mantel ticked with a soft and steady heartbeat. And at the kitchen table, Henry Benson sat with his coffee, the steam rising like a ghost of habit. He wasn't a man of extravagance, never had been. At 74, he was the kind of grandfather who kept peppermints in his pocket, folded his socks neatly in the drawer, and ironed his shirts even when no one was around to notice. He had once been a builder, a craftsman who shaped wood into homes that held families for generations. But now his hands, though still strong, shook just enough that he left the heavy work behind. What remained was the ritual coffee at 8, the paper folded just so, and family arriving for Sunday brunch. His daughter Claire had made it tradition years ago. She'd bring her husband, Mark, and their 2 children, settling the house with the noise of young voices. For Henry, those hours were the anchor of his week. He lived for the sound of little feet running across the floorboards he had laid with his own hands, for the soft chatter of his daughter humming as she set out the dishes. And he lived most of all for the hug. 7-year-old Emma had been giving him the same kind of greeting since. She was barely walking. She would burst through the door, hair wild from the car ride, backpack clutched to her chest as if she were traveling across countries instead of neighborhoods. And always she would run into his arms. It was the sort of embrace that reminded him he was still needed, still loved. Still a part of something more than the silence of his own 4 walls. That Sunday morning began no different. The clock struck 10, and the door opened with the familiar squeak. Claire's voice called out a cheerful "Dad, we're here," and the little parade filed in. Coats were hung, shoes kicked off, and the smell of cinnamon rolls filled the air as Claire carried a tray. She'd baked earlier that morning. Henry stood from his chair, heart lifting at the sight of Emma. She spotted him, her eyes lighting up in recognition, and for a moment he thought the ritual would hold. He opened his arms wide, ready for her to leap forward, to press her small frame against his, to remind him again that he still mattered. But she slowed, her nose wrinkled, her lips pressed into a small, puzzled line. And when she stopped just short of his embrace, the words slipped out with the blunt honesty only children can manage. "Don't hug me," she said. "You smell like old people." The room stilled, though no one commanded it to. Claire dropped a fork into the sink, the clatter sharper than it should have been. Mark glanced away, pretending to adjust the fruit bowl. Henry's arms froze midair, the gesture unfinished, suspended like a man reaching for something that wasn't there. Emma's face showed no malice. She wasn't cruel. She was 7, too young to understand the power of words once spoken. She tilted her head, waiting for him to laugh it off, waiting for the world to keep spinning. And Henry did laugh, at least on the outside. A soft chuckle, the kind meant to soothe the air and reassure the grown-ups. "Well," he said, lowering his arms, "I suppose that's one way to put it." Emma skipped past him, already distracted by the promise of cinnamon rolls on the table. The moment to her was already gone. But Henry remained rooted where he stood. The echo of her words, hanging heavier than he let on, smelled like old people. It wasn't the first time he'd felt the sting of age, but it was the first time it had come from someone he loved most. He could feel the weight of it settling on his shoulders, more unshakable than any load he had ever carried as a builder. For the first time in a long time, he felt the invisible line between past and present, between the man he used to be and the one he was now. The rest of brunch unfolded with the usual noise and chatter, but inside Henry, something had shifted. His laugh was quieter. Smile felt heavier. And though he never let on, the words had carved themselves into him with a sharpness he hadn't expected. He had leaned in for love and received a truth he wasn't ready to face. And as he cleared the table later, gathering crumbs into his palm, Henry knew that a simple comment from a child had just opened a door he hadn't planned to walk through. Door leading somewhere he did not yet understand. The sound of Sunday faded slower for Henry that afternoon. The house, once full of laughter and the scrape of chairs against the hardwood, grew quiet again, too quiet. He stood at the kitchen sink long after his daughter's family had pulled out of the driveway, staring at the window above the faucet. The glass reflected back a man he didn't quite recognize, a little slouched, his hair thinner at the crown, the lines on his face more stubborn than he remembered. He had lived alone for nearly a decade. Ever since Margaret passed, his wife's touch still lingered in small things. The curtains she'd sewn from fabric bought on clearance. The way she'd insisted on mismatched mugs because life's too short for everything to look the same. Even now the kitchen bore her signature, warmth stitched into the bones of the room. Yet today it felt hollow, as though Emma's comment had slipped into the walls themselves. Draining out the color, Henry lowered himself into his chair. At the table, the one spot where the cushions sagged just enough to fit his shape. He should have picked up his paper or turned on the radio or maybe poured another cup of coffee. Instead, he sat with hands folded, eyes unfocused, listening to the echo of 7-year-old honesty replaying in his mind. "Don't hug me. You smell like old people." The words weren't cruel, but they stuck. Children didn't mean to wound, but sometimes their truths sliced cleaner than any adult insult. He thought of Emma's face untroubled, already moving on to the sweetness of a cinnamon roll. She would never know what she'd said had followed him here. To this empty chair, he lifted his hand, cupping his nose briefly. What did old even smell like? Stale aftershave. The faint musk of medicine bottles lining the bathroom shelf. Mothballs he still tucked into his closet out of habit. Oh, or maybe it was something less tangible. Something that clung to his skin after 74 years of living. A scent of memory, of dust, of days gone by. For the first time, Henry wondered if people smelled pity on him, the way dogs seem to smell fear. A breeze pushed through the open window, stirring the curtains. The sound reminded him of summers long ago, when Emma's mother, Claire, was small and ran barefoot through the yard, her laughter twining with the rustle of leaves. He had smelled different than of sweat and cedar, of sawdust from building houses, of the faint sweetness of his wife's perfume when she leaned against his shoulder. Time had a way of changing scent, just as it changed hair color, strength, and the speed of footsteps. He sighed long and deep. The silence stretched so wide he thought he could hear the clock tick across the room like a hammer driving nails. But beneath the sting, Henry felt something else, something quieter, heavier. It wasn't just about a smell. It was about belonging, about the slow drift of being noticed less, hugged less, needed less. Emma's words had been a small spark, but they lit a much larger fire of doubt. He rubbed his palms together, feeling the roughness of skin that once gripped hammers and lumber with ease. Now they trembled just enough to make handwriting jagged. He could hear Margaret's voice in his head, patient and firm. "Don't you let one sentence steal your spirit, Henry Benson." She'd always had a way of pulling him back from the ledge of self-pity. But tonight her voice was only memory, soft and fading. He tried to shake it off. He rose from the table, fetched his paper, and sat back down, but the words blurred on the page. He wasn't reading, he was waiting. Waiting for the hollow feeling to pass, waiting for the sense of being pushed aside to fade. It deedened single quotes to Dad. Outside the sun tilted low, shadows stretching long across the yard. Somewhere a neighbor's dog barked, then fell silent. The world moved on, indifferent. Henry leaned back, closing his eyes. He had learned to endure pain in his prize. I had learned to endure pain in his delaner. Look at this. Like Souther? Look at this. Well, look at this. And we all know I've been exploring that. The world moved on. MHO was in it. We would be Celinded Dev. In subplate. We would see with Conleasley Dekov. I tell if they had learned to we want to see. I see if they have live with MA, K8. We say and K do we see I can you we to see call with Fik Kai Kasi to go to see I can we to cooks to we to see kick with you to see you can kai gaki to wiki we kak did I you I kai did with furry we got cat kai for the read can cat to what he leave the Life, the broken bones of a builder's trade, the shattered grief of burying a wife too soon. But this pain was smaller, quieter, almost invisible. Yet it pierced just the same dot. And in that pause, in that aching stillness, Henry knew this moment wasn't one he could simply laugh away. Emma's words had carved out a hollow space inside him, one he would have to decide how to fill. The pause was not just silence. It was the beginning of a question he did not yet know how to answer. When the world tells you you've grown old, where do you go to feel alive again? Henry had always thought of walking as medicine. Even after. The doctor cautioned him about his knees. Even after Claire gently suggested he drive more and stroll less, he insisted on his daily routes. Keeps the rust off, he'd say with a half smile. As if his body were just another old machine he could keep running with enough oil and movement. That Sunday, after the family had gone and the house had grown too quiet, he pulled on his cardigan and stepped outside. The air was cool, sharp enough to sting the lungs, but he welcomed it. He shut the door behind him, slid his hands into his pockets and started down the cracked sidewalk that lined Maple Street. It was a familiar path. One he could walk blindfolded, past the Petersons' yard with the leaning fence he had offered to fix a dozen times, past the small brick church with its signboard promising all are welcome, though Henry hadn't stepped inside in years, past the oak tree that dropped acorns, like marbles every fall, where neighborhood kids used to play war games with sticks for rifles and wild imaginations for armor. But that day, the walk felt heavier. Each step echoed Emma's words, as though his shoes tapped them out against the pavement. Smell like old people. Smell like old people. He walked faster, as if he could outpace them, but they clung stubbornly at the corner. He paused beneath a street lamp that hummed faintly. He caught his reflection in the small glass of a storefront window, a bent figure, shoulders curved inward, cardigan loosed around a body that had shrunk with time. Once he had been broad and strong, the kind of man who could lift lumber onto his back without a second thought. Now he saw someone softer, edges rounded by age. The reflection unsettled him. He turned away quickly and crossed the street, favoring his right knee. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long. The town itself hadn't changed much in decades. The diner still displayed its world's best pie sign, though Henry suspected the title had been self-awarded. The barber shop still had its spinning pole, though the barber inside now worked slower, hands trembling more than they once did. Mason, Georgia, was a place where time inched forward reluctantly, and yet, for Henry, time had moved too fast. He remembered walking this same route with Emma when she was just a toddler. She'd toddle beside him, one small hand gripping his finger, the other clutching a balloon from the county fair. "Faster, Grandpa," she'd squeal, legs pumping like pistons. He would pretend to chase her, letting her win every time, her laughter ringing like bells in the evening air. Now she was 7. Sharp-tongued in that innocent way children are, and he was the one left stumbling behind. The gap between them felt wider than the length of Maple Street. He slowed near the park. The benches were empty, swings swaying slightly with the breeze. He sat down, exhaling as though the air carried weight. For a long moment he simply watched the sky, painted orange and pink. The park smelled of cut grass, faint gasoline from the maintenance shed, It's gonna something sweet from the honeysuckle near the fence? It occurred to him then that smell was more than scent. It was memory. It was the cedar shavings from his workshop years ago, Margaret's lavender soap, the cinnamon rolls Claire baked when she wanted to cheer him up. Did he really smell like old people, or did he simply carry the fragrances of a life lived long of stories pressed into skin and fabric like stubborn perfume? He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, listening to the rustle of leaves. Maybe Emma hadn't meant harm. Maybe she had just noticed the difference between new and old. Between the world that still felt fresh to her and the one that felt worn to him, but even knowing that didn't ease the ache. As dusk settled, Henry rose again and began the slow walk home. The porch light of his bungalow glowed faintly ahead, a small beacon against the dark. He realized as he approached it that he wasn't walking just to stretch his legs. He was walking to escape the silence, to outrun the weight of a sentence that had cut deeper than it should have. But the truth waited for him at his doorstep, steady and unyielding. He could not walk away from it. That night as he stepped back, inside and shut the door behind him, Henry understood something had shifted. A quiet fault line had opened beneath his feet. He didn't yet know where it would lead. But he knew this. Tomorrow's walk would have to be different. The house greeted Henry the same way it always did, quietly, without fanfare. The porch light threw a pale circle on the rug just inside. The door. The air held a faint trace of coffee and furniture polish, scents so familiar they had become the background hum of his life. He hung his cardigan on the wooden peg near the entryway and slipped off his shoes, placing them neatly side by side the way Margaret had taught him decades ago. He moved into the living room, where the television sat dark and silent, a relic he rarely switched on. Instead, the room's true heart stood along the mantel above the fireplace, a collection of photographs. Frames of mismatched sizes lined the narrow shelf, their glass faces catching the dim light. Henry lowered himself into his armchair and stared at them. He always did this in the evenings, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, as if the faces inside could still talk if only he listened hard enough. Tonight, the ritual felt different. Emma's words hovered in the air, sharper, in the silence. They pressed against the photographs, against the memories, as though testing their strength. The first photo he picked up was the oldest, his wedding day. Margaret stood beside him, her smile wide and unguarded, a spray of daisies in her hand. She had insisted on daisies, not roses. Roses are for everyone else, she'd said. Daisies are for me. He traced the edge of her face with his thumb, remembering the way her hair had smelled of lavender that morning. To him, she had never smelled like old people. She had smelled like life itself. He set the frame down and reached for another. Claire at 10, missing her front tooth, grinning with wild pride as she held up a fishing pole taller than she was. He remembered the lake, the way the water shimmered with sunlight, and the sound of her squeal when the fish tugged. He could almost hear it now, faint but real, echoing through the years. Then came the photos of Emma. Baby Emma wrapped in a hospital blanket, her face red and scrunched, her tiny hand curled around his finger. Toddler Emma on the porch swing, squealing as he pushed her higher and higher, her curls bouncing with every kick of her legs. And the most recent, from last Christmas, where she sat cross-legged beside the tree, her eyes wide at the sight of a new bicycle. Henry lingered on that one. In the picture, she had her arms wrapped around him, cheeks flushed with joy. He remembered the feel of her small body against his, warm and trusting. That was only months ago. How quickly a child's world could shift from love without question to blunt honesty. He leaned back, clutching the frame to his chest. The word old carried so much weight now. Old was photographs on a mantel, each one a frozen moment from a time that no longer existed. Old was remembering details no one else cared to recall, like the sound of Margaret's laugh when she burned the first pie she ever baked, or the way Claire used to line up her crayons in perfect rainbow order before she would start drawing. Old was carrying memories no one else had the time or the patience to carry. And yet, as he stared at the photographs, Henry realized something else. Old was also the thread connecting all these moments. Without his years, there would be no mantle, full of faces, no stories stitched into frames. He placed the photo of Emma back in its place and let his hand rest on the shelf. The wood was smooth beneath his palm, worn down from years of dusting, polishing, and lingering touches. Margaret had chosen this mantelpiece herself when they built the house, saying it would hold their history. She had been right. The clock ticked softly behind him. Outside, a car rolled down Maple Street, headlights flashing briefly through the curtains. Life moved on beyond his walls, but here, within this small living room, time folded in on itself. Henry exhaled slowly, his chest tight but steady. The photographs were more than decoration. They were proof that he had lived, that he had loved, that he had mattered. Maybe Emma couldn't see that yet. Maybe to her he was just a man who smelled of old clothes and medicine. But someday, when she was older, she might stand before her own mantle and understand. For now, he whispered to the faces in the frames as if they could hear him. "I'm still here." And though no one answered, the room felt less empty. As though the photographs themselves had nodded in quiet agreement. The morning after felt heavier than most. Henry woke with the familiar stiffness in his joints, but that wasn't what dragged him down. It was something less visible, something that sat in the chest and pressed against the ribs. A weight. He shuffled to the kitchen, filling the kettle and setting it on the stove. The sound of water heating filled the silence, a low hum that reminded him of distant trains. He reached for the coffee tin, the same dented container he'd used for years, and measured the grounds by instinct. When the first tendrils of steam rose, he poured, listening to the comforting drip into his cup. The smell should have brought peace, usually did. But now he caught himself wondering. Did the scent of coffee cling to him, mingling with the mothballs in the closet, the musty books in the living room, the faint medicine on the counter? Did it all blend into what Emma called old people? He sat at the table, coffee warming his hands. The paper lay folded in front of him, untouched. Headlines blurred. The clock ticked too loudly. He realized he hadn't turned on the radio, something he usually did without thinking. Music or talk. Shows always filled the empty corners. But this morning, he hadn't bothered. Silence carried weight when no one was there to share it. Henry tried to shake it off. He told himself he was being foolish children, spoke without filters. Emma hadn't meant harm. She'd forgotten her comment already, no doubt. But the words clung to him like damp clothes, and the silence only made them louder. He looked around. The room, the refrigerator hummed softly, plastered with old magnets and faded grocery lists. A calendar with cheerful daisies marked September, but no notes filled the squares. His days were empty, routine stacked upon routine. Coffee, newspaper, walk, lunch, nap, supper, bed. Repeat. The realization struck him. His life had become quiet to the point of invisibility. That was the real sting of Emma's words. Not the mention of smell, but the implication of irrelevance. Of fading into the background like wallpaper no one noticed anymore. He thought of Margaret again. She had filled silence with her voice, her laughter, even her scolding. When she was alive, the house had never been heavy. She could turn the act of folding laundry into a conversation, the clatter of dishes into music. Without her, silence had grown roots. Henry stood, restless. He moved to the window, peering out at the neighborhood. Across the street, Mrs. Peterson was kneeling in her garden, tugging weeds with gloved hands. A teenager whizzed by on a bike. Earbuds in, oblivious to everything but the rhythm in his head, the mail truck rolled slowly down the block. Life went on, ordinary and unremarkable. Yet somehow it all seemed louder than his own existence. He pressed a hand against the glass, feeling its coolness. Is this it? He wondered. Is this what growing old men watching from behind a window while the world spun forward without you? The kettle whistled sharply, startling him. He had forgotten he left water boiling for a second cup. He turned off the stove, but the sound lingered in his ears. A reminder of how easily distractions could swallow his day. Returning to his chair, he tried again to read the paper. His eyes drifted to the obituaries first, as they always did now. A man his age had passed from pneumonia. A woman, slightly younger, went peacefully, surrounded by family. He folded the paper closed, pressing a hand against it as though to keep death itself from spilling onto his table. The silence thickened. Henry leaned back, closing his eyes. He remembered the hug Emma had refused, the way her nose wrinkled, the way her words landed like a stone. He felt that stone now, heavy in his chest. This was the silent Watan accumulation of grief, of years, of small moments that built into something nearly unmovable. And yet he wasn't ready to let it win. Not yet. He opened his eyes, staring at the ceiling. He told himself he would find a way to ease this heaviness, to step beyond silence. But for now, all he could do was sit, breathe, and carry it. The coffee cooled in his cup. The clock ticked on. The house held its silence, patient and unrelenting. And Henry, though he didn't know it yet, was waiting not just for the day to pass, but for something or someone to remind him the wait wasn't permanent. Monday. Mornings had always followed the same pattern for Henry. He would wake early, sometimes before dawn, make his coffee, and then take his morning walk down Maple Street. Afterward, he'd return home, fix himself a modest breakfast, usually toast and scrambled eggs, and spend an hour tinkering in the shed behind the house. The shed had once been his workshop, filled with saws, hammers, and the smell of cedar. Now it mostly housed tools that hadn't been touched in years, and jars of screws and nails, arranged with the kind of precision that only mattered to him. It was the comfort of routine that kept him steady. Life had slowed, but at least it was predictable on that particular Monday. However, something small but important shifted. The morning began as expected. He rose, made his coffee, sipped it slowly, and pulled on his walking shoes. But as he stepped, outside the air felt different-charged, unsettled. A storm had passed in the night, leaving the streets damp and the air heavy with the smell of wet earth. Puddles dotted the sidewalks, reflecting slices of sky. Henry breathed deeply, letting the freshness fill his lungs. He started his walk, nodding to familiar landmarks as if greeting old friends. The leaning fence, the church, the oak tree. But when he reached the corner near the small grocery store, he stopped. A piece of paper, soaked from the rain, clung to the telephone pole. He peeled it off gently, careful not to tear it. It was a flyer. Bold letters stretched across the top. Community veterans picnic this Saturday at Oakwood Park. All welcome. Beneath it were photos of families gathered under tents, children waving flags, men and women in uniform smiling at long tables. The ink had bled in places, but the message was clear enough. Henry stared at it, unsure why his chest tightened. He wasn't a veteran. He had worked with his hands, built homes, raised a family, but he had never served in the military. Still, he felt a strange pull, like the flyer had been meant for him to find. Maybe it was the word community. Maybe it was the faces smiling in the rain smudged. Photographs. He folded the flyer carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He told himself he'd throw it away when he got home. But instead of continuing his walk, he turned back. Inside his kitchen, he smoothed the damp paper across the table, staring at it as if it might speak. He could almost hear Margaret's voice, teasing him. Go. What's the harm? You might even enjoy yourself. But the thought of sitting among strangers, especially men and women with stories of sacrifice he couldn't match, made him hesitate. He pushed the flyer aside and tried to focus on breakfast. Toast popped up from the old toaster, slightly burnt on one edge. He scraped it with a knife, listening to the sound of crumbs falling onto the plate. But even as he ate, his eyes kept drifting back to the flyer. Routine tugged at him his shed. Waited, the tools still neatly lined on the walls. Yet for the first time in years, the thought of slipping back into the same pattern didn't comfort him. It felt like a cage. He left his dishes in the sink, something he rarely did, and went out to the shed. He stood in the doorway, looking at the dust-covered workbench. The jars lined like soldiers. Usually, this place gave him a sense of control, of purpose. Today, it only reminded him of stillness, of years slipping by unnoticed. Henry sat on the stool, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. He realized he hadn't felt anticipation in a long time. He lived in memory and habit, never looking toward the next thing. But that flyer, now drying on his kitchen table, had cracked something. Open. Maybe Emma's words had done more than wound him. Maybe they had shaken him awake. For the first time in years, Henry considered breaking his routine. He wasn't sure if he would go to the picnic. Wasn't even sure why he was thinking about it. But the thought lingered, stubborn and alive. As the morning sun pushed through the clouds, Henry stood slowly and left the shed. He didn't return to his chair with the paper. He didn't switch on the radio. He walked back to the kitchen, picked up the flyer, and pinned it to the refrigerator with a faded daisy magnet Margaret had once loved. His routine, for the first time in decades, had been disrupted. The flyer stayed on Henry's refrigerator all week. Every time he reached for the milk or the butter or the carton of eggs, his eyes caught the bold black letters. Community Veterans Picnic this Saturday at Oakwood Park. All welcome. First, he told himself it meant nothing. He wasn't a veteran. He had no business being there. That was a gathering for men and women who had worn uniforms, faced battles, carried scars, both visible and invisible. What could a retired carpenter offer them besides awkward silence? Still, each morning when he poured his coffee, his eyes drifted toward the daisy magnet holding the flyer in place. Each night, as he reached for leftovers, he read the words. Again, tracing them with tired eyes. By Wednesday, the question had rooted itself in him. Why not? It wasn't until Thursday morning, however, that the unexpected invitation came. Henry had just returned from his walk when he saw his neighbor, Paul Henderson, standing by the mailbox at the end of the street. Paul was younger, maybe in his late 50s, and still carried himself with the straight-back bearing of the army man he once was. His front lawn bore a flagpole, and Henry had often seen him carefully folding the stars and stripes at dusk. They'd exchanged polite nods over the years, brief conversations about weather or yard work, but little else. This morning was different. Paul waved him over, his face breaking into a grin. Henry. Morning. He called. Henry adjusted the brim of his cap and ambled across the street. Morning, Paul. Paul held a small stack of envelopes, sorting them idly as he spoke. Listen, I was wondering, are you going to the picnic Saturday? Henry blinked. Me. Yeah, Paul said. They're inviting the whole community. It's not just us old war dogs. It's families, neighbors, anyone who wants to come. Food, music, games for the kids. Figured you might like it. Henry hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Oh, I don't know. Not sure I'd fit in. Paul chuckled. Fit in? Henry, half the folks there won't be vets. They just come to support, share a meal, and listen to stories. You've lived here longer than most of us. You're part of this town's history. That counts for something. Henry opened his mouth, then closed it again. Part of him wanted to decline politely, to retreat back to his quiet routines. But Paul's words stirred something. History. That was what the photographs on his mantle represented, wasn't it? History worth sharing. Paul must have seen his hesitation, because he leaned closer. Tell you what, I'll save you a seat. At my table, no pressure. Just come by, grab a plate, and if you don't like it, you can leave. But I've got a feeling you'll enjoy yourself. Henry found himself nodding slowly. I'll think about it. Good, Paul said, clapping him on the shoulder. We start at noon. You know where to find us? As Henry walked back to his house, the invitation echoed in his mind. wasn't just about food or company. It was about being wanted. Someone had noticed him, thought to ask him, saved him a place, back inside. He glanced again at the flyer on the refrigerator. The edges had curled slightly from the dampness, but the words were still bold, still insistent. He smoothed it flat with his palm, lingering there a moment longer than he meant to. That afternoon, he caught himself thinking about the park about, children running, grills smoking, laughter rolling across the grass. Imagined himself sitting among strangers, maybe even telling a story or two. The thought frightened him, but it also quickened something inside. A spark he hadn't felt in years. The weight of silence that had pressed on him all week seemed a little lighter now. An unexpected invitation had cracked it open, and though Henry wouldn't admit it out loud, it was already leaning toward yes. By Friday evening, Henry still hadn't made up his mind. The flyer remained pinned beneath the daisy magnet on his refrigerator. Crisp now after the paper had dried from its time in the rain. Every time he reached for something, milk for his coffee, butter for his toast, he read it again. Community Veterans Picnic. All welcome. The words seemed to glare at him, daring him to follow through. He carried the thought of it with him as he moved through his routine. While shaving, he caught himself imagining how he might look sitting among strangers. While dusting the shelves, he wondered whether anyone would bother speaking to him if he did go. And later, as he stood at the sink washing his single plate and single fork, he pictured himself walking into Oakwood Park, searching for Paul's promised seat, only to find the tables already filled, his presence unnoticed. The reluctance grew from two roots, pride and fear. Pride whispered that he didn't belong there. He hadn't worn a uniform, hadn't saluted a flag on foreign soil, hadn't marched in cadence with a band of brothers. His service had been different, quiet, local, the kind that built porches and laid foundations but never earned medals. What right did he have to sit among those who had risked their lives? Fear whispered something else, that he would be exposed. Not for what he hadn't done, but for what he had become. An old man smelling of mothballs and liniment, trying to find relevance in a place that didn't need him. What if Emma's words rang true, not just in her mouth, but in the eyes of strangers? What if they too smelled the age on him, the dust of years clinging to his clothes, and quietly wished he'd stayed home? That night, he sat in his chair by the mantel, the photographs staring back at him. Margaret's smile seemed steady, almost teasing, as if she knew the argument going on. Inside him, he imagined what she would say. It's probably something blunt, because Margaret had never softened truth. Henry, you're alive. It's reason enough to show up. Don't sit here and rot because you're worried about smelling old. He smiled faintly at the thought, but it didn't erase the knot in his chest. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies. The kind of day when sunlight slants just right and the air hums with possibility. He brewed his coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the flyer. Noon, it said. He had hours to decide. At 10 o'clock, he fetched his walking shoes and laced them slowly. Each not a conversation with himself. Go, don't go. Stay safe. Take a chance. He stepped outside, the air warm against his face. The neighborhood stirred with weekend lifelawns being mowed, dogs barking, children shrieking in play. The world moved as if it didn't care whether Henry showed up at Oakwood Park or not. He walked his usual route, but his feet felt heavier. Every corner reminded him of what waited or didn't, depending on his choice. When he reached the bench by the park entrance, he stopped. From where he sat, he could already see the bright splash of tents being set up in the distance. Hear the faint clatter of grills, the laughter of volunteers. His heart thud dot. For 20 minutes he sat there, watching from afar. The reluctance pressed on him, thick as a fog. His knee ached. His pride hissed its warning. His fear whispered again. He could turn around right now, walk home, heat up a can of soup, and tell himself he hadn't really wanted to go anyway. And yet, he didn't stand. Instead, he pulled the folded flyer from his pocket. The ink had smudged where rain had once blurred it, but the words still remained. All welcome. He read them again, slower this time, as though testing their sincerity. And though the reluctance didn't vanish, he felt the faintest tug in the other direction, not strong enough to move his feet just yet, but enough to keep him seated on that bench, watching, waiting. Considering the decision wasn't made, not fully. But Henry knew the truth. If he walked home now, the silence waiting for him would feel heavier than ever. And so, for the first time in years, he let the possibility of change sit beside him. Saturday came, clear and bright, the kind of September morning that carried a hint of autumn but still clung to summer's warmth. Henry stood in his bedroom, dressed but uncertain. He wore his cleanest shirt, a pale blue button-down that Margaret had once said brought out the color in his eyes. The collar was a little soft, the fabric thinned by years of washing, but it was pressed neat. He had shaved carefully, even splashed on a touch of aftershave, though the sharp scent made him wonder if Emma's words would haunt him here too. He moved slowly through the house, gathering the small things that steadied him. His cap from the hook by the door, his wallet from the dresser, the keys to his old sedan. The car itself was not a relic, a faded green Chevy that coughed to life only after 2 turns of the ignition. He sat behind the wheel, hands resting on the steering wheel for a long moment, staring through the windshield as if the street outside might give him an answer. The silence pressed. Go or don't go. Once he backed out of the driveway, the decision would be made. With a deep breath, Henry turned the key. The engine rumbled, loud enough to draw a glance from Mrs. Peterson across the street, who was trimming her hedges. She gave a small wave, and Henry, almost embarrassed, lifted a hand in return. He shifted into reverse and rolled slowly down the driveway, his chest tight. The roads were familiar, the same ones he had driven countless times. Maple Street, lined with its tired oaks. The corner store where he used to buy ice cream cones for Claire. The intersection that always seemed to take too long to change. Each landmark carried a memory, and each memory whispered of the years behind him. He gripped the wheel tighter, as if holding on could keep those years from slipping entirely away. Traffic was light. Families were already out. He saw a truck, piled with bicycles, a minivan filled with children pressing their faces to the glass. Music thumping faintly from someone's open window. The world looked younger from his driver's seat, and he felt every bit of his age. The closer he came to Oakwood Park, the more his pulse quickened. He could see the tops of tents rising above the trees, bright white against the sky. Balloons bobbed in the breeze, a flag snapped on its pole. Stomach churned. He thought briefly about turning around, telling himself he had tried, that the drive itself had been proof enough of courage. But then he remembered Paul's promise. I'll save you a seat. He eased the Chevy into the parking lot, which was already filling with cars. Minivans, pickups, a few motorcycles lined in a neat row. The smell of charcoal reached him even before he opened his door, mingling with the faint sweetness of cut grass. Voices floated through the air, laughter, greetings, the chatter of children. Henry sat for a moment longer, engine idling, watching through the windshield. A boy ran past holding a paper flag. A woman carried a tray of hamburger buns to a long table. A cluster of men in matching caps shook hands, their postures easy, practiced. His reluctance returned like a tide. He could sit here all afternoon, engine running, pretending he belonged while never stepping out. No one would know the difference. No one would miss him if he left. But then he spotted Paul. The man stood near a picnic table, tall and straight-backed, scanning the lot. As if on cue, Paul raised his hand, waving in Henry's direction. The gesture was simple, but it hit Henry like a lifeline. He wasn't just imagining a place for himself here. Someone had actually saved it. Henry turned off the ignition. The engine stuttered into silence. He sat for a beat, listening to the quiet, then opened the door. His knees protested as he stood, but he straightened his back, adjusted his cap, and shut the door with more resolve. Then he felt the long drive was over. The harder journey, the one into the crowd, was just beginning. The grass at Oakwood Park was damp from the morning dew, soft underfoot as Henry made his way from the parking lot toward the cluster of tents. The closer he walked, the more the sounds enveloped him. Children squealed as they chased each other across the open field. A country band strummed on a small stage, their guitars bright against the murmur of voices. Somewhere nearby, a grill hissed smoke, curling skyward with the smell of sizzling burgers and hot dogs. Henry paused at the edge of it all, suddenly aware of how small he felt. He tugged at the brim of his cap, scanning the crowd for Paul. There were so many faces, men and women in folding chairs. Young families spread across picnic blankets, veterans wearing caps embroidered with words like Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq. Some wore faded uniforms or jackets heavy with patches. Others came dressed simply, but their posture carried a weight of belonging. It was a world Henry wasn't sure he had earned the right to enter. He stood for a moment too long, caught between stepping forward and retreating back to the safety of his car. Then, through the tangle of people, he spotted Paul again. True to his word, the man stood by a long wooden table under one of the tents, waving with the confidence of someone who had been waiting. "There you are." Paul's voice carried easily over the noise when Henry approached. Was beginning. "To think you'd chickened out?" Henry gave a half smile, adjusting his cap. "Almost did." "Well, I'm glad you didn't," Paul said, clapping him on the shoulder with the kind of familiarity that felt like welcome, not intrusion. "Come on, let me introduce you." Paul guided him toward the table where several men and women already sat, plates piled with food. "Here's Henry Benson," Paul announced. "Best carpenter on Maple Street. Built half the porches you've sat on without even knowing it." The group looked up, nodding, smiling, offering greetings. One man with a weathered face extended his hand. "Nate, Vietnam 68. Nice to meet you." Henry shook it firmly, surprised at how natural it felt. Another, a woman with short silver hair and a soft Southern accent, added, "I'm Ruth, Army nurse, Desert Storm. Sit down, Henry. Get yourself a plate before it's all gone." Their ease unsettled him at first. He had expected formality, suspicion, maybe even questions about why he was here. Instead, they treated him like someone they had been saving a place for all along. He filled a paper plate with a burger, a scoop of potato salad, and a handful of chips, then sat down at the edge of the bench. For a few minutes, he ate quietly. Listening, the table buzzed with conversation. Stories flowed, some lighthearted, some heavy, but all laced with the unspoken bond of people who had carried burdens together. Henry expected to feel like an outsider. Instead, he felt something different: curiosity. He found himself leaning in to hear Ruth describe nights spent in a desert hospital, or Nate recalling the taste of rations. Their words painted pictures vivid enough to step into. Between bites, someone asked, "And what about you, Henry? You serve?" Swallowed, shaking his head. "No, built houses. Spent my life with wood and nails." The man nodded without judgment. "That's service too. Kept folks sheltered." The simplicity of the answer loosened something in Henry's chest. He hadn't expected recognition, yet here it was. As the afternoon stretched on, Henry noticed other things: a child tugging at her father's sleeve to ask about the medals on his jacket, a group of teenagers volunteering at the grill, an elderly woman sitting in a wheelchair surrounded by people who bent low to listen. The picnic wasn't just about veterans. It was about community, layers of lives woven together in one place. For the first time in a long time, Henry didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel like a relic tucked behind a mantle. He felt present. The reluctance that had weighed him down all week began to ease. And though he didn't yet know it, the picnic grounds were about to give him something he hadn't expected at all: a hug that mattered. The burger on Henry's plate was half-eaten. When it happened, he had been sitting quietly at Paul's table, listening more than talking, his fork pushing potato salad into small patterns. The hum of the picnic surrounded him, the strum of the band, children laughing near the playground, the sizzle from the grill. He felt like a man standing in the shallows of a river, watching the current rush past, not quite ready to step in. Then a shadow fell across the table. "Mind if I sit?" Henry looked up. A man in a wheelchair rolled to the edge of the bench. His face was tanned, deeply lined, but his eyes held the kind of brightness that came from surviving storms. A Navy cap sat snug on his head. The words Marine Corps Vietnam veteran stitched in gold across the front. "Not at all," Henry said, shifting slightly to make space. The man extended a hand, steady despite the tremor in his wrist. "Name's Walter. Most folks just call me Walt." Henry hesitated for half a beat. Then he wiped his palm on his pant leg and reached out. Their hands met, firm, warm, grounding. It wasn't the kind of handshake that ended quickly. Walt held on just a second longer, as if to make sure Henry knew it mattered. "Henry Benson," he said quietly. "Well, Henry," Walt replied. "Looks like we're neighbors today." He nodded at Henry's plate. "Food's not bad, huh?" Henry smiled faintly. "Better than what I usually cook for myself." Walt chuckled. "That bad?" "Toast and soup most nights," Henry admitted. "Ah, a man of simple tastes. I can respect that." Something eased between them, like the first hinge of a door creaking open. For a while they ate in companionable silence, but then Walt started talking about his grandkids, about how he'd learned to maneuver his wheelchair over every bump in town, about how he still came to these picnics because you never really stopped needing a tribe. Henry found himself listening, really listening, the way he used to when Claire was a child telling stories about school. He noticed the way Walt's hands moved as he spoke, animated, alive. He noticed the way other men and women greeted him as they passed, slapping his shoulder, calling his name. Walt was clearly known here, respected. At one point, Walt leaned in and lowered his voice. "You serve Henry." The question didn't sting the way Henry feared it might. He shook his head slowly. "No. Spent my life building houses." "Good work," Walt said, no hesitation. "We need homes as much as we need soldiers. Can't rest easy if you've got nowhere to lay your head." The words landed heavier than Henry expected. He had spent years doubting the value of his labor, wondering if swinging hammers and measuring boards really meant anything in the long run. But Walt's tone carried no condescension, only conviction. It felt like the first time in years that someone had acknowledged him not for what he lacked, but for what he had given. The handshake replayed in Henry's mind even as they kept talking. It wasn't just skin against skin. It was an anchor, a way of saying you belong here too, without needing the words, by the time the band struck up another tune. Henry realized something startling. The silence inside him, the heavy, relentless quiet that had followed him all week, was loosening. Not gone, not yet, but shifting, making space. Walt patted his arm. "Glad you came out today, Henry. You'll find folks here worth knowing." Henry nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I think I already have." And for the first time in what felt like a long while, he meant it. As the afternoon wore on, the long wooden tables began to fill not just with plates and cups, but with stories. That was the real meal at Oakwood Park, the exchange of memories, the unwrapping of moments too heavy to carry alone. Henry sat a little straighter on the bench now, no longer tugging at his cap or hiding behind his food. Walt had introduced him around, and introductions had turned into conversations, conversations into laughter. For the first time in years, Henry didn't feel like the quiet man on the outside looking in. It started when Ruth, the army nurse with the silver hair, leaned forward. "You ever notice," she said, her voice carrying just enough to gather attention, "how every story starts with the weather? Hotter than blazes that day, or colder than the devil's breath." The table chuckled. Nate, the Vietnam vet, lifted his cup. That's because the weather's the one thing you can't forget. I remember the rain in '68 like it's still dripping on me. Another man chimed in, younger, maybe in his 40s. For me, it's the sand. Couldn't shake it. Wasn't my boots, my hair, my teeth. Iraq was just one big sandbox. Someone set on fire. Laughter rippled again, but beneath it was something else: recognition. The unspoken understanding of people who had lived through extremes most couldn't imagine. Henry listened, at first content to let the current of voices wash over him. The stories ranged from lighthearted mishaps, burned rations, pranks in the barracks, to darker fragments that made the air around the table grow heavy. One man spoke of a convoy that never returned. A woman mentioned the sound of helicopters, still haunting her dreams. Through it all, no one judged, no one interrupted. They leaned in, nodding, holding the weight of each other's words without flinching. Henry realized this was the true heart of the picnic, not the food or the music, but the circle of stories. Here, pain wasn't hidden. It was spoken aloud, given shape, and softened by the presence of others. At some point, Walt turned to him. "What about you, Henry? Got any stories worth telling?" Henry felt his throat tighten. "I'm no soldier," he said quickly. "I don't have those kinds of stories." But Ruth shook her head gently. "Everyone's got a story." He hesitated. For years, his stories had lived only in photographs on the mantel or in memories that surfaced late at night when the house was too quiet. They seemed too ordinary compared to the tales of war and survival around him. And yet, he thought of the homes he had built, the porches where families gathered, the walls that had sheltered laughter and tears, the roofs that had kept storms at bay. So he cleared his throat. "Well," he began slowly, "I once built a house for a young couple. They didn't have much, just enough for the basics. But they wanted a front porch, said it was important. I told them I'd try to make it happen. When it was done, I came by a week later. They were sitting out there with their baby, rocking in the evening breeze. I thought to myself, that porch was the best thing I ever nailed together." The table went quiet. Then Walt grinned. "Sounds like you gave them more than wood and nails. You gave them a place to live life." Nate raised his cup again. "Amen to that." Henry felt a warmth spread through him, slow and steady. His story hadn't been about war, but it had been about service in its own way. And the way the others received it without dismissal. With respect made something inside him settle. The circle of stories expanded, and Henry was no longer on the outside. He was part of it now, his voice woven into the tapestry. And for the first time since Emma's careless words, he felt less like old people and more like a man still carrying worth. The sun had shifted by the time Henry realized how long. He had been sitting at the table. Shadows stretched long across the grass, and the music from the band softened into background hum. Children grew quieter too, their energy ebbing as the afternoon wore on. The smell of charcoal had thinned, replaced by the sweetness of cookies laid out on paper plates. Henry leaned back on the bench, his plate long empty, his heart fuller than it had been in months. The circle of stories had wound down, conversations splintering into smaller groups, laughter spilling in bursts. For once, he wasn't watching from the outside. He was inside the current, carried along. Then Ruth, the silver-haired nurse, pushed herself up from the bench. Her movements were careful, slowed by age, but her presence carried the same firm grace that must have once commanded a ward of patience. She walked around the table and stopped beside Henry. Without asking, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Henry Benson," she said softly, "I'm glad you came today." He looked up, surprised. "Oh, so am I." Her smile deepened, and then she leaned down, wrapping her arms around him. It wasn't a quick, polite embrace. It was firm, steady, the kind of hug that lasted just long enough to remind a person they were seen. Her cheek brushed his, her perfume faint but warm lavender mixed with something he couldn't name. Henry froze at first. It had been a long time since anyone had hugged him like that. Since Margaret, since Claire had stopped needing her father's arms the way a child once did. since Emma had pulled away with her scrunched nose and sharp words. But then he let himself sink into it. His arms rose, hesitant at first, then stronger, returning the embrace. And in that moment, something shifted. The hug carried no pity. It wasn't about obligation or politeness. It was about connection. It said you belong here in a language older than words. When Ruth pulled back, her eyes shone. "You remind me of my late brother," she said. "He was a builder too. Hands? Just like yours. Strong, but gentle. Don't underestimate what you've given people." Henry swallowed hard, unable to find a reply. His throat was too tight, his eyes stung in a way he hadn't expected. Walt, watching from across the table, chuckled. "Careful, Henry. She hugs everybody. But I'll tell you hers are the kind that stick." Henry managed a small laugh, brushing at his eyes as if dust had blown in. But inside, he felt something he hadn't realized he was craving. The hug mattered. It had reached a place Emma's words had left raw, covering the wound not with denial, but with something sturdier, dignity, around him. The picnic carried on, but for Henry the moment slowed. He felt the warmth of Ruth's arms lingering on his shoulders, the steadiness of being held without question. It wasn't about smelling old or young. It was about being human, still worthy of touch, of affection, belonging. He glanced across the field and saw families gathering their things, folding blankets, chasing their children toward the car. He imagined Emma there, watching, and wondered what she would think if she saw her grandfather hugged, not out of obligation, but out of genuine care. Would she understand? Would she see him differently? Henry exhaled, long and slow, as Ruth returned to her seat. The silence inside him, the heavy, relentless weight he had carried all week, had cracked further. For the first time since that Sunday morning, he didn't feel reduced to the scent of age. He felt lifted by the strength of a single embrace. And he knew deep down that this hug was more than just kindness. It was a reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures carried the greatest power. It was the hug that mattered. The picnic carried on in the easy way gatherings do when the hardest part, the introductions, the breaking of ice, has already been done. The music softened into familiar tunes, the kind people could hum along to without thinking. Children tugged at balloons that bobbed against the sky. The smell of grilled meat gave way to the sweetness of pies and cobblers set out on the dessert tables. Henry sat with his hands resting on his knees, still feeling the ghost of Ruth's embrace. Her lavender perfume lingered faintly, not cloying, not heavy, but subtle. It reminded him of Margaret, who had always tucked a sachet of dried lavender into her dresser drawers. For a moment, the memory pinched, but then it softened into something else, a realization that scents, like stories, were not just remnants of the past, but carriers of connection. He breathed in deeply, letting the air fill his lungs. What he smelled was not old people, not the mothballs in his closet or the aftershave Emma had wrinkled her nose at. No, here at Oakwood Park he smelled belonging. There was the smoke of the grill, still faint in the breeze, mixed with the Thames of ketchup and mustard spilled across paper plates. There was the warm yeast of bread rolls pulled from foil, the buttery sweetness of peach cobbler cooling on a picnic table. There was the sharp bite of freshly mown grass underfoot and the faint resin of pine trees ringing the park and beneath. In all there was something more intangible, a scent made of laughter, of shared memory, of community gathered together. A smell that couldn't be bottled or named but could only be lived. Henry closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the sounds around him, breathing it all in. For so long he had thought of himself as separate, carrying the smell of age like a burden. But here, surrounded by people of every generation, he realized everyone carried scents. The young smelled of sunscreen and sticky popsicles. Parents smelled of sweat and sunscreen, of baby powder and bug spray. The veterans carried the faint scent of leather jackets, pipe tobacco, motor oil. Together, they blended into something whole. He opened his eyes and noticed a young boy sitting cross-legged on the grass a few feet away, chewing on a cookie. The boy's hair stuck out in uneven tufts, and chocolate smudged his chin. He looked up at Henry curiously, then crawled closer. "You smell like wood," the boy announced matter-of-factly, his small nose twitching. Henry blinked. "Do I?" "Yeah, like the tree house my dad's building. Smells good." The words landed like a bomb. Wood, not old, not forgotten. Wood strong, useful, alive. "Thank you," Henry said softly, his voice catching. The boy shrugged already, distracted by a balloon floating past. But Henry held on to the words as if they were precious. He thought of his workshop, of the cedar planks and pine shavings that had clung to him for years. Maybe that was his scent after all, not decay, but creation. Not age, but endurance. When Ruth leaned over again to offer him a slice of pie, Henry accepted it with steady hands. "Best cobbler in 3 counties," she said. He took a bite, and the cinnamon sweetness mixed with the buttery crust filled his mouth. It was another kind of belonging, one that entered through taste. As sure and grounding as the hug had been, for the first time in a long while. Henry didn't feel self-conscious about how he might appear or what others might notice. He was part of something. The picnic didn't demand he prove himself or change who he was. It welcomed him as he came, sense stories and all dot, and as the band struck up another tune. Henry realized that belonging wasn't about how others defined you. It was about stepping into a space where your presence mattered simply because you showed up. Here, he didn't smell old. He smelled like life. It began subtly, the way ripples always do, small at first, then spreading wider until they touched everything. Henry didn't notice it right away. He was too caught up in the warmth of Ruth's hug, the boy's innocent remark about wood, the sweet bite of cobbler melting on his tongue. But as he sat among the tables, something shifted. People he had never met before began nodding at him as they passed, offering small greetings. A woman with a stroller smiled, the kind of smile that said, "I see you." A teenager carrying a tray of lemonade cups stopped to ask if he'd like one, though his plate and cup were already full. Even the band's lead singer, strumming through an old country song, tipped his head when his eyes passed over Henry's table. At first, Henry thought it was coincidence. But then he realized something about being drawn into the circle of stories about Ruth's embrace had marked him differently. He was no longer invisible. It was part of the fabric of the day. The ripple extended in conversation. Nate leaned closer, asking about Henry's work. "What's the hardest thing you've ever built?" You wanted to know. Henry found himself describing a church steeple he had once helped raise. The way the entire community had shown up to guide the beam into place wasn't just me, he said. Took all of us pulling ropes in unison. One slip and the whole thing would have come down, Nate grinned. Sounds a lot like a convoy. Everyone doing their part or else none of you make it home. Others at the table nodded, and Henry felt the comparison sink deep. His life's work wasn't a world away from theirs. Different tools, different battles, but the same principle, strength in numbers. Lives held up by community. A ripple also reached beyond words. As Henry walked to the desert table later, cane tapping lightly against the ground, though he rarely admitted needing it, he felt eyes follow him. Not with pity, but with respect. Someone stepped aside to let him through. Another man offered him the first slice of apple pie. Small gestures, but they added up, layering into something that felt almost like honor. Even the children carried the ripple. The same boy who had said he smelled like wood ran past again, this time calling, "Hey, mister!" Before darting off. It was nothing, a fleeting acknowledgement, but it rooted Henry to the spot for a moment. Children didn't often notice him anymore, not unless prompted by their parents. To be called out, included, even in plays that mattered, Henry realized then how rare it was for him to feel this way. At home, silence pressed like weight. In town, he was a nod on the street, a polite sir at the grocery counter. Even with his family, love often came tangled with distance. But here, among strangers turned companions, the ripple had carried him outward, away from isolation. When he returned to his seat, Ruth patted his arm. "See? You belong here more than you think." Walt, listening, added, "Belonging isn't about where you've been. It's about showing up where you're needed." Henry let those words settle. Maybe he hadn't needed the picnic. Not exactly. Maybe the picnic had needed him. His stories, his presence. His quiet witness they had filled a space he hadn't known was waiting. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of gold, Henry felt the ripples stretch even further, deep into himself. For years, he had believed his best days were behind him, that the most important chapters of his life had already been written. But here, on a wooden bench under a canvas tent, surrounded by voices and laughter, he realized something he hadn't dared to before. There were still ripples left to make by the time the sun began its slow descent. Casting long shadows across Oakwood Park, Henry felt something stirring inside him. It wasn't loud or sudden, but steady like the soft hum of an engine finally catching after years of disuse. He sat quietly at the picnic table, watching the swirl of people around him, and realized he was seeing the world with new eyes. For years, he had thought of himself as a man winding down, his relevance shrinking with each passing season. He was the quiet grandfather in the corner, the man neighbors nodded to politely, the name attached to houses most people no longer remembered he had built. And after Emma's words, "Don't hug me, you smell like old people," he had begun to believe his life had narrowed to that single description, old. But here, among veterans and families, he understood something different. It wasn't about the smell of aftershave or the dust of years on his clothes. It wasn't even about whether he had served in uniform. It was about presence, about showing up, about carrying forward the weight of a life lived and sharing it in ways that mattered. He thought back to Ruth's hug. The boy's comment about would the ripple of kindness that had spread once he allowed himself to sit among strangers? Those moments weren't accidents. They were evidence of something larger. That dignity and belonging weren't tied to age, but to connection. Henry lifted his hands, studying them in the fading light. They were rough, scarred, trembling slightly with age, but they told a story. They had built porches where couples sat in the cool evening air. They had raised walls that sheltered families through storms. They had held Claire's tiny body when she was born, steadied Margaret's arm when she was weak, taught Emma how to hold a pencil. His hands weren't relics. They were proof. He turned his gaze outward again. Across the park, he saw an elderly man missing a leg, laughing as a group of teenagers surrounded him, hanging on his every word. He saw a young mother balancing a baby on her hip while a veteran helped her fix a stroller wheel. He saw children darting between tables, weaving joy into the day's fabric. The realization deepened. Everyone here carried something: stories, scars, skills, losses. None of them smelled simply of age or youth. They smelled of life. Henry thought of Emma then, her wrinkled nose, her unfiltered honesty. He understood now that she hadn't meant cruelty. She was only 7, still learning the language of compassion. But someday she would need to understand that growing old wasn't about fading away. It was about carrying forward the essence of who you were and sharing it with those who came after. And maybe, just maybe, it was his role to teach her that. Not with lectures, but with presence. With stories told, hands held, hugs given. With the quiet insistence that he was more than a scent she didn't like. The realization filled him with something almost forgotten. Hope. The band struck up a final song. A gentle ballad that rolled across the park like a benediction. People swayed in their seats, some singing softly, others simply listening. Henry closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. He felt the silent weight he had carried for so long begin to lift, replaced by a lightness he hadn't thought possible. When he opened his eyes again, the sky was painted in gold and rose. He drew in a deep breath, catching the mingled scents of grass, smoke, pie, and laughter. And for the first time since Emma's words, he didn't feel defined by what he feared he was losing. He felt anchored by what he still had to give. It was a simple realization, but it changed everything. He didn't smell like old people. He smelled like history, like survival, like life. The ballad from the band drifted into silence, leaving only the chatter of voices and the occasional bark of a dog. People were starting to pack up, the grills cooling, the paper plates stacked, balloons tugged down from the tents. The park was still alive with energy, but it had softened into that pleasant hum that follows the height of a gathering. Henry sat on the bench, content to let the moment linger. His plate was empty, his cup half full, his body a little weary, but his spirit lighter than it had been in months. He was just about to rise, thinking perhaps it was time to head home, when a tug at his sleeve stopped him. He turned. A boy, no older than 9, stood there. His hair was sun-bleached from summer, his cheeks freckled, his hands sticky with melted popsicle. He looked at Henry with wide eyes, the kind of look children give when curiosity outweighs shyness. "Mister?" the boy asked. "Yes." "Henry," said, his voice gentle. "Can you tell me a story?" The words landed like a spark. For a moment, Henry froze, unsure how to answer. A story. He had listened to so many that day, tales of deserts and jungles, of battles fought and brothers lost. His own life seemed quieter, less dramatic. What story could possibly matter to a boy who had just spent the day surrounded by heroes? But the boy waited, earnest and expectant. Henry cleared his throat. "What kind of story do you want?" The boy shrugged. "Any kind? A good one." Henry glanced around. Walt and Ruth were watching from a few seats away, smiling faintly as if they understood the importance of the moment. He set his cup aside and patted the bench beside him. "Sit down, then." The boy plopped onto the seat, his legs swinging freely. Henry folded his hands, searching his memory. He thought of the houses he had built, of the years spent measuring, and hammering, of Margaret's laughter echoing in their first small kitchen. Then one memory rose clearer than the rest. "Well," Henry began slowly, "when your age, I wanted to build something with my hands. My father showed me how to use a hammer, but I wanted to prove I could make something all by myself. So one summer, I decided to build a tree house. Didn't have much, just some old boards and bent nails, but I worked on it every afternoon." The boy leaned closer, eyes bright. "It was crooked as could be," Henry said, chuckling. "One wall leaned, the ladder was missing a rung, and the roof leaked whenever it rained. But when it was done, I invited my best friend over, and we sat up there eating peanut butter sandwiches like it was the finest castle in the world." The boy giggled. "Did it fall down?" "Not right away," Henry said with a smile. "Lasted long enough for 100 adventures, or so it felt. That treehouse taught me something. It doesn't have to be perfect to be worth it. Sometimes just making a place to belong is enough." The boy nodded solemnly, as if storing the lesson. "I want to build one too." "You should," Henry said, his voice softening. "And don't worry if it leans a little. What matters is who you share it with." The boy hopped off the bench, satisfied. "Thanks, mister," he called, before running off to chase his friends. Henry sat back, the echo of the conversation filling him with unexpected warmth. A child had asked for his story and listened. Not because it was grand or heroic, but because it was his. He realized then that perhaps this was how it began, passing on not just the structures he had built, but the lessons they carried. Maybe his role now wasn't to hammer wood or climb ladders, but to tell stories that gave others a place to stand. And as the evening deepened, Henry felt the quiet weight inside him shift once more, lighter, gentler, replaced by something steadier. Purpose. The boy's question lingered long after he darted off into the swirl of children. Henry stayed seated on the bench, his hands folded loosely in his lap, the fading sun catching the rough lines of his knuckles. A story, that's what. The boy had asked for, and for the first time in a long while, Henry had given one. Not a grand tale of war or travel, not something plucked from history books, but his own crooked little memory about a treehouse. And somehow, it had been enough. He thought about that as the band packed up their guitars and people began folding chairs. The picnic was winding down. Some families left quickly. Kids bundled into cars, voices still high with sugar and excitement. Others lingered, reluctant to let the day go. The park itself seemed reluctant too, the sky holding onto its orange glow as if to prolong the gathering. Henry considered leaving. He had done more today than he'd expected. He'd shaken hands, listened to stories, even received a hug that still warmed his shoulders. But just as he reached for his cane, he heard a voice behind him. "Mr. Benson, isn't it?" He turned. A young woman stood there, mid-20s at most. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, her t-shirt tucked into jeans, a name tag clipped. To her collar that read Danielle, she carried a notebook pressed against her hip, the kind reporters or students might use. "Yes," Henry said cautiously. "I'm helping with the local newspaper," she explained. "We're covering the picnic. Would you be willing to share a story with me? Something about today or even from your life here in town?" Henry blinked. "A story? From me?" Danielle smiled. "Yes, everyone's got one. You built houses, right? I've heard your name from a few folks around here." Heat rose in Henry's cheeks. He wasn't used to being singled out anymore, certainly not by someone so young. He hesitated, but then he remembered the boy with the popsicle-stained fingers, how intently he had listened. If a child could value his crooked treehouse story, maybe this young woman could too. He nodded slowly. "All right, I'll tell you one." They moved to a quieter spot near the edge of the park, where the noise of the crowd faded into the rustle of leaves. Danielle flipped open her notebook. "Pen ready?" Henry leaned on his cane, gathering his thoughts. "There was a house I built back in '79, he began. Small place, nothing fancy. The couple didn't have much money, but they wanted a home of their own. The husband told me he'd settle for 4 walls and a roof, but his wife asked if I could build a bay window. Said she wanted a place for plants to catch the morning sun." He paused, remembering the way the woman had smiled when he'd finished, sunlight spilling through glass, onto her pots of herbs and flowers. "It wasn't in their budget, but I built it anyway. Didn't charge them for the extra work. Figured it was worth more than the money. Years later, I drove past that house. That window was full of plants, green and alive. The couple was sitting right there, drinking coffee. That's when I realized sometimes the smallest things you build are the ones that last longest." Danielle's pen scratched across the page. When she looked up, her eyes were shining. "That's beautiful," she said softly. "People need stories like that." Henry cleared his throat, embarrassed but strangely proud. "It's just what I did." "Exactly," she replied. "That's what makes it matter." As she walked away, notebook tucked under her arm, Henry felt something shift again. Sharing his story hadn't taken anything from him, had given something. To the boy, to the young woman, maybe even to himself. His life wasn't finished. His stories weren't done. The realization settled deep. Stories didn't have to be epic to be worth telling. They just had to be true, and Henry had more of them left to share. The sky was turning violet when Henry finally made his way back to the Chevy. The park had thinned out, though laughter still floated faintly from the last clusters of people lingering near the tents. He slid behind the wheel, his body tired in that satisfying way it hadn't been for years. As he turned the key, the engine rumbled to life, and he sat for a moment, letting the vibrations run through him. He took one last look at the park. Flags still fluttered on their poles. Children's footprints still marked the damp grass. And in the distance, he could just make out Ruth hugging another soul who looked like they'd needed it as badly as he had. The sight made him smile. Wasn't just a picnic, he realized. It was a gathering of fragments, made whole again, if only for an afternoon. The drive home was quiet. Maple Street rolled past in familiar rhythm, the oak trees leaning toward one another, the Petersons, crooked fence, the church with its worn white paint. Yet everything looked slightly different tonight, touched by the warmth he carried with him. When he pulled into his driveway, the porch light glowed like it always did, but it seemed brighter somehow, less lonely. He shut off the engine, stepped out, and listened to the cicadas buzzing in the trees. The air smelled faintly of barbecue smoke still clinging to his clothes, of grass and laughter he had brought home with him. Inside, the silence greeted him. But it didn't feel heavy this time. The house hadn't changed, but Henry had. He set his keys on the counter and paused, glancing at the refrigerator. The flyer still hung beneath Margaret's daisy magnet, its edges curled and faded. He smiled at it now, no longer as a challenge, but as a marker of the day he had chosen to step forward. He walked into the living room and sank into his armchair. The photographs on the mantel waited, their glass faces glowing softly in the lamplight. For years they had seemed like ghosts, reminders of a life finished. But tonight they looked different as, though each photo was leaning toward him, urging him to keep telling their stories. He picked up the frame of Margaret on their wedding day. "You'd have liked it today," he murmured. "They fed me, like a king. And someone hugged me reminded me what it feels like." His voice caught, and he chuckled at himself. "Imagine that. Me sitting in a park talking like I belonged there." He set the photo back and picked up another Emma as a toddler on the porch swing. He traced the frame with his finger. Her words from last week still stung, but they no longer sat on his chest like a stone. Instead, they echoed softer now, drowned out by other voices. Ruth's warmth, Walt's handshake, the boy's innocent declaration, "You smell like wood." Henry leaned back, closing his eyes. He could still hear the music, faint and lingering, like it had followed him home. He could still feel the weight of belonging pressed into him through hands, through stories, through the shared air of that circle of tables, and in that echo he realized something vital. He hadn't just attended the picnic. It carried part of it home. The warmth, the laughter, the reminder that he mattered, they had lodged themselves in the walls of his house. Softening the silence, Henry opened his eyes again, breathing deep. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel like a place of waiting. It felt like a place of return, and he knew then that this was only the beginning. The ripple of the day had followed him home, and its echo would not fade quickly. The following Sunday arrived with the same rhythm as always. The clock ticked, the coffee brewed, the hum of cicadas pressed against the windows. Henry sat at his kitchen table, watching sunlight spill across the floorboards. He felt the familiar mix of anticipation and nerves. Claire and her family would be here soon. The routine was steady as clockwork. But this week, something inside Henry had shifted. He thought of the picnic, the circle of stories, Ruth's hug, Walt's handshake, the boy who had said he smelled like wood. Those moments hadn't just lifted him for a day. They had rewired something deeper. He no longer sat waiting for his family to arrive like a man clinging to scraps of meaning. He sat ready to give, to share, to let the echo of belonging ripple outward. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway reached him. Doors slammed, voices carried, and soon the front door opened with Claire's cheerful call. "Dad, we're here." Henry stood, smoothing his shirt. Emma came first, barreling into the room with her usual energy, hair bouncing, cheeks pink from the car ride. She stopped short when she saw him waiting. For a moment, the memory of last week hung between them, her wrinkled nose, her sharp words, his arms frozen midair. But Henry didn't reach out this time. He simply smiled, steady and calm. "Morning, Emma." She tilted her head, studying him. Something in his stillness seemed different, quieter but stronger. Then, without warning, she ran forward and wrapped her arms around his waist. "Grandpa?" she said, squeezing tight. Henry froze, then gently lowered his hand onto her back, holding her with care. She smelled of shampoo and maple syrup, sweet and innocent. And when she looked up at him, her face was full of something that caught his breath. "You smell like outside," she said, "and cinnamon." The words hit him like sunlight breaking through clouds. He laughed softly, the sound rumbling deep in his chest. "That's so? I'll take it." Claire appeared in the doorway, holding a tray of muffins. She paused, watching them. Relief softened her face. "Looks like someone missed you," she said. Henry met her eyes and nodded. No words needed. The rest of the morning unfolded, as always, Claire fussing in the kitchen, Mark setting the table, Emma and her brother squabbling over crayons. But the weight that had shadowed last week's brunch was gone. Where silence had once pressed heavy, now laughter filled the air at one point. Claire asked, "So what did you get up to this week, Dad?" Henry sipped his coffee, then set the cup down. "Went to that veterans picnic at Oakwood Park." Claire looked surprised, really. "I didn't know you were planning to." "Wasn't at first," Henry admitted. "But a neighbor invited me. Figured I'd give it a try." He paused, then smiled faintly. "Met some good people. Heard some good stories. Shared one or two myself." Claire's brows lifted. "Shared stories? You?" Henry chuckled. "Turns out I've got a few worth telling after all." Claire's expression softened into something proud. "I'm glad you went, Dad." So was he. As the morning stretched on, Henry found himself less a bystander and more a participant. He helped set out the food, told a silly joke that made Emma laugh so hard milk nearly spilled from her nose, and even shared a short story about the crooked treehouse he'd once built. Emma's eyes widened, her giggles echoing through the room. And when the family finally packed up to leave, Henry stood at the door, Emma hugging him tight once more. "See you next week, Grandpa," she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. "See you then, kiddo," he replied, steady and warm, as he watched them drive away. Henry realized the truth. He hadn't just returned to his family. He had returned to himself. The house grew quiet again after Claire's car turned the corner and disappeared down Maple Street. For years, that silence had been sharp, pressing against Henry like an accusation. But today it felt different. Today it hummed with echoes, the laughter of children, the smell of cinnamon, the warmth of arms around him. He walked slowly back into the living room and lowered himself into his chair by the mantel. The photographs stared back at him there, glass faces catching the afternoon light. He studied them one by one. Margaret with her daisies, Claire missing her front tooth, Emma as a baby gripping his finger. Each picture was a story, and for the first time in a long while, he no longer felt like the last page of the book. Emma's hug had been small. It's a kind only a child could give, quick and fierce, unpolished, unburdened. But it carried more weight than she could possibly know. Last week she had pulled away, wrinkling her nose. This week she had run toward him, arms outstretched. The change was not just hers, it was his too. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and let the memory play back in his mind. Her voice bright and certain. "You smell like outside and cinnamon." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. Outside and cinnamon he'd take. That over mothballs and age any day. But deeper than the words was the truth they carried. She had chosen him. Chosen to come close, to hold on, to let him know he still mattered in her world. Henry thought of the picnic, again the circle of veterans. Ruth's lavender-scented hug, Walt's steady handshake, the boy who wanted a story, the young reporter, scribbling notes. All those threads had woven together into something stronger than the silence he had carried for so long. And now those threads had reached back into his family, binding him tighter to the people who mattered most. He rose and walked to the mantel. With careful hands, he picked up the photo of Emma on the porch swing, curls bouncing, her small arms stretched wide as he pushed her higher. He set it back, then whispered into the stillness, "We're not done yet, kiddo, not by a long shot." The house creaked softly as if in agreement later. As the sun dipped lower, Henry stepped onto the porch. The air smelled of cut grass and distant wood smoke. He sat in the swing, the same one from the photograph, and let it sway gently beneath him. The breeze brushed his face, cool and kind. He thought of Margaret, of how she used to sit beside him here, their knees bumping as they shared quiet conversations. He thought of Claire as a girl, curled against him with a book. He thought of Emma, small and growing, her laughter ringing. Through the years, he closed his eyes and imagined them all still there. Their presence stitched into the wood, into the air, into him. He felt the warmth of belonging, not just from a community picnic or a granddaughter's hug, but from a lifetime of giving and being given too. When he opened his eyes, the street was empty, quiet except for the rustle of leaves. But Henry no longer felt alone. The closing hug wasn't just Emma's arms around him that morning. It was every embrace he had carried forward, every story shared, every reminder that age was not an ending but a gathering of moments worth passing on. And as he sat on the porch, the evening light painting the sky in soft gold, Henry smiled. He didn't smell like old people. He smelled like home.